Hey, Val, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am excited as well. It's great to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to discussing some vegan related topics that have never been discussed on the show before in its
Yay.
entire history. So I am super excited. But I'm curious. I think before we get into our topics du jour, I'm curious about your vegan story. So, like, how did you first come to veganism? I always ask my guests, most of whom are vegan, of course, not everyone, but when they are, it's just kind of a good background story, origin story. So I'm curious about yours.
Yeah. So I've been vegan a little over 4 years. And I was kind of one of those people who it was very gradual and then all of a sudden, like all at once, right?
Okay.
So I know some people talk about like having that sort of overnight light switch moment. And I did experience that 4 years ago, but it was many years in the making. Um, and I actually have, I can send you the link for your show notes, but I did a little spoken word poem that basically is my journey to veganism.
Ooh, yeah, if you could, we'd
And
love to share that.
yeah, it's really fun. I'm not like I don't do a lot of creative writing, but I was like, I'm really proud of this one. But yeah, so it kind of started like the little, the seeds that are planted, right? And so like my uncle being vegetarian and I'm like a child growing up in Texas, like, what are you? I don't understand. And just surrounded by the normal like meat eating kind of, especially in the South sort of thing, and had vegetarian friends over the years, and like never felt super comfortable with eating meat. Was never my favorite part of a meal, but I was very much like comfortable in my cognitive dissonance,
Hmm.
and then uncomfortable, and then I would shove that down, and then I did flirt with vegetarianism on and off over the years, but and never in any of that. I don't know if it was just that I didn't I must have not been really seeking out information. I just thought like, oh, I'll just get these Morningstar things and eat that, and never ever until 4 years ago did I hear anything about like the dairy and egg industries and all the other stuff. So
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
didn't come into, I mean, I never, if you'd told me 5 years ago you're going to go vegan for the rest of your life, I would have like laughed in your face, because I was like, why would anyone ever give up cheese? That's absurd. I've always been a foodie, and coming from my own like eating disorder recovery um, experience, I always thought like, oh, I never want to feel restrictive with food again. And that to me has been one of the hugest pieces of liberation, and like why I'm like out there like hashtag anti-diet vegan, is because
Mm.
I don't feel restricted with food. So like once I realized that it wasn't like, 4 years ago when I did sort of, had a sort of, it was during a loving kindness meditation that I was doing. And at the time I worked in a residential treatment center that happened to be spread out over 2,000 acres of
Wow.
cattle farms. so
Wow.
we've got,
That's
all
different.
these, right. We've got these buildings all over the place. And then we'd have like the owners of the treatment place they were no longer the same ownership, but we were spread out on this land with these cattle pastures. So I'd be like driving from one building to another building on our campus, and I'd have to like sit and wait because somebody was moving all the cows from this pasture across the road to this pasture, and pigs too. And I remember like the dissonance starting there. And then so then I'm like
Mm.
doing the meditation one day and I'm like thinking of the cows and I'm like, damn it. Like, so I went and bought some vegetarian cookbooks and I was like, okay, I'm going to try this again. But every time I would do it, I'd be like, just feel super deprived and like eventually give up. But that time I came across Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer and was
Mm.
like, oh crap. And he actually doesn't really get into eggs and dairy, shockingly, in that book, but it opened the door. And I finally like watched all the movies and the documentaries and stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes it easy. Like I am done with that. And it's just that was kind of the end of it. And it's been really great. Like I didn't necessarily expect my husband to come along with me, but at the same time, like he was always that guy who, even though he was in his own world of dissonance of like, grilling steaks and stuff, he wouldn't kill a spider. Like he'd always take any
Hmm.
bug and rescue it and take it outside the house. So it also like wasn't surprising. And once, he kind of consumed all that information with me. And so that's been really nice kind of being in that together.
That's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
you never know, right? I mean, it always starts with, well, I think it doesn't always start, I should say. The long-lasting change always starts with us on an individual level. And I feel like it's not going to be super productive to, like harass people or nag them if they're your spouse. Like
Yeah.
that approach doesn't work. You basically have to just have your own experience like you did, your own erasing of the cognitive dissonance, if you will. And then other people are going to notice, especially if you live with
Mhm.
them, especially if you're sharing cooking duties and such. So that's great to hear. I mean, it doesn't always turn out that way, and we can't
Right.
really expect that it will if we're,
Sure.
a lot of our listeners are new vegans or they're thinking about going plant-based. We can't expect that automatically everyone in our lives is going to be vegan all of a sudden, but it's kind of an extra bonus when they come along. So that's really good to hear.
It is, and just seeing how, like, that's part of the attractivism, and that even if, like, I mean, I have been, as I'm sure you and anyone who's been vegan long enough has probably been a part of someone's story of going vegan, which is, like,
Mm.
always like, "Oh my gosh, this is so
Mhm.
cool." But even the people in my life who I just know, like, are way more open to eating vegan foods because they've tried it with us and they're like, "This is really good. Like, I will go to this restaurant again." Like, that's all cool to see how even if people don't necessarily come along or right away, like you are still planting seeds that who knows what will happen.
Exactly. And you know what? There's probably people out there who have you or possibly me as part of their vegan story, and we don't even know.
So true.
So
Yeah,
you never know. Just got to keep doing your thing.
exactly.
Yeah, if you have any sort of online platform, sometimes even just doing your own thing and people at the gym are noticing, people like friends of friends, you never really know. So I,
Hmm.
I kind of like that whole concept of like, well, sure, there are people that we for sure have impacted that we know of, but there are other people as well, not just you and me, but all of our listeners that have been positively affected by what we're doing, which is
Right.
pretty exciting.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Well, let's get into what you do. We have a lot of topics that, again, have not been discussed on this show before that I find super interesting. They're very vegan centric. Not everything we talk about is vegan centric on this show.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's about fitness, sometimes it's about myth busting in the general, nutrition world, but today it's all about veganism. So, you are Val the Vegan Therapist.
Yeah.
So, can before we get into this whole concept, what is it that you do with your clients, with your patients? What is it that you are helping people with?
Sure. Well, and I think like this is the cool thing about the work that I do is it does very much like there's the piece where I'm like, yes, I want to focus on supporting the vegan community, but then
Mhm.
there's also the fact that I just have a private practice as a therapist in Nashville, and most of my clients may not even know that I'm vegan. And sometimes I do have people specifically reaching out to me for that reason. So it's cool that like I have a website that's very easily findable, and people sometimes will be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have this opportunity." But, there's a lot of people who I'm supporting. I work mostly with adult women, anxiety, depression, relationship stuff, shame, um, and eating disorders and trauma. And so those people might be vegan, they might not be, and it's just super rewarding work getting to help people kind of heal and gain better tools for relating with their own challenging experiences and thoughts and feelings. So I love that I have the opportunity to specifically reach out to this segment of people, but it's not exclusively vegans that I serve. That would be a pretty tough,
Yeah.
especially in a local practice. I think in the coaching world, like who knows, maybe one day I'll just be doing fully coaching online and I can work with people wherever. But for now, the bulk of my work is in my local therapy practice that are mostly not vegan clients.
Got it. Okay, interesting. Yeah, you never know the way things are going now with everyone working online and folks just in general being more open to the concept of having a coach online or a therapist online. You never know. You could have an
Exactly.
entirely vegan practice at some
I
point.
know. Could happen.
Yeah. But I mean, based on your website, which I have gone through, it's pretty obvious that your website at least is branding itself as like, I'm the vegan therapist. And
Yes.
so when people are Googling,
Mhm.
vegan counseling, vegan therapy, you would come up.
Mhm.
So what's the deal? Like having a vegan therapist as a vegan. I mean,
Yeah.
does it matter? Why is it important?
So my answer to that is sort of like maybe for some
Mm,
people it really matters, and for others, like, and I've even asked some of my ethical vegan friends, and they're like, nah, I don't, my therapist's not vegan, I don't really care.
mhm,
And then I know other vegans who are like, and I would say, like, I've definitely worked with, since I've been vegan, I've worked with professionals of course, all different kinds who are not vegan. But if I have the opportunity, especially the more that I'm really trying to get plugged into activism work, I really do like, if there's someone who aligns with that part of my values, like, great. And they can also
mhm,
give me what I need. They can like help me with what I need help with. Then, yeah, of course I would want that. I sort of liken it to how, some folks who are Christian, like, they may be able to get help with anxiety and depression from a therapist who's not Christian. But they might find it really beneficial to work with someone who shares that worldview or that lens. And I kind of view it similarly with veganism. So, and
mhm,
then there's sort of like two segments of vegan folks who I think might look specifically for a vegan therapist. One being those folks who are just like, yeah, this is really important to me, that, even if I'm not even coming in here talking about vegan related issues, that just that I know you get that. And I know
mhm,
you share that value of seeing animals as, beings who are worthy of protection and respect and all of that. And then the other segment are folks who maybe are having specific challenges related to their veganism, or and I see that in a number of different ways, like whether it's feeling isolated and alone because maybe they live in an area or have family members or friends who like just don't get it, and
mhm,
especially in that newer to veganism transitional phase. And then there's, maybe people who are have had a lot of either trauma, like one of my previous podcast guests had worked in a primate research lab in college, and it was a
oh,
traumatic,
wow.
she has PTSD from it.
Uh-huh.
So, understandably, it would be ideal for her to work with a vegan therapist who really got why that was a traumatic experience for her. Um, and also just folks who feel a very heavy guilt and sadness for the plight of animals in the world, even if they're no longer contributing to it. Folks who identify as empaths or highly sensitive person, HSP, kind of need some support from someone who get that and don't like vilify that sensitivity.
That makes absolute sense, yeah. I mean, from personal experience, I have a counselor who happens to be vegan, but we never talk about it. It never comes
Yeah.
up. I went there
Yeah.
for a specific case or specific reason, which was anxiety and kind of like, developing my toolkit around that. But I kinda like knowing that she gets it, it's like it's always in the background, so it has actually never come up in sessions,
Yeah.
veganism. We just both know, yeah, we're on the same page, we're both vegan, and it's kinda nice. But if I can totally understand, if I had challenging situations that were directly related to veganism, I would for sure want someone who gets it and who lives it or who has lived it for a while.
Hmm.
And so I like what you say. It kind of depends. It depends what the reasoning is. Sometimes it's not important, but sometimes it can be super important.
Hmm.
And so in those cases where veganism is important or when it actually comes up in the work that you do, what are some of the things that you work on? Like, I know that navigating these emotional and social challenges can be difficult in a lot of different
Hmm.
ways, especially when it's people who are very close to you, who might be just completely not getting it, or who might be trying to like undermine someone's efforts to be vegan in the first place. So maybe you can kind of go into what the importance is of navigating these vegan specific challenges and what those challenges might be in the first place.
Yeah. I really think that there's such an opportunity for us in the vegan community to be talking more explicitly about these challenges, the social challenges and the emotional challenges, both of transitioning to veganism and then also of maintaining that. And it's funny because I was thinking about all of that, and then I haven't read her new book, but Colleen Patrick Goodrow's new book, Joyful Vegan, is
Mm.
essentially about a lot of that.
Oh, interesting.
And
I
I
didn't
mean,
know that.
she's not a clinician, but obviously I call her my fairy godmother, my vegan fairy godmother. And um, but yeah, and so it's like recognizing that it's usually when people don't stay vegan, I mean, yeah, there might be the people who are purely coming in for like a plant-based eating approach for
Mhm.
wellness. And then like it's understandable why maybe they don't stay vegan. But even people who do get plugged into like the climate or the animal pieces of veganism, sometimes they're not staying vegan because there's these challenges that are happening. And like if all we're doing is telling people like, well, here's where you get your protein and that kind of stuff, like
Yeah,
we're not
right.
helping them figure out like, what do I do when I go to my friend's house and I just feel like none of them understand me anymore. And they're just
Mhm.
like grilling out on a barbecue like it's just any other day. And all of a sudden I just feel like I love these people, but I'm very confused because I see them as loving, progressive, whatever people. And now I'm just sitting here watching them eat carcasses. And so it's like, and that's a
Yeah.
little dramatized, but you get what I mean.
Mhm.
That we know that that transition can be really challenging. And then even after the transition, yeah, if you do have family or workplace or other challenges where it's really difficult or you feel dismissed, and not, included, like I think of like my husband works in public schools, and the PTA does like so much great work with like, oh, we want to come in and feed the teachers. Like it's great. They don't have to do that. But they know that he's vegan and they'll be like, we got this salad for you. And it's, the kind of thing that's like there's like salad and like two vegetables on it. It's like,
Uh-huh.
thanks. Okay. So yeah, I feel like there's all these social and emotional challenges. And for people who are in relationships where their partner does not choose to be vegan, and
Mm.
that's just really hard because obviously I can't speak to that myself. I don't know how I would handle that, but I have helped other folks kind of navigate that, and I know some people who very successfully navigate that, and I know other people who've gotten to a place in their veganism or in their activism where they just say like I couldn't have
Mhm.
someone in that role in my life who did not see this the way that I do. And recognizing that neither one of those people are wrong, that it really has to be individualized. So those are some of the things. And like I said, just how do we cope with knowing everything that's going on out there every day for the people who that weighs really heavy on? Like how can I validate that and say like, yeah, that's actually, was it Krishnamurti who said it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's I totally understand why you're feeling that heaviness and that sadness. And how can we learn some skills to be able to hold that and still move through your life and find joy and find, freedom from some of that heaviness so that you're not in it all the time because that's just not sustainable.
Absolutely. That's a really good way of putting it. So, I mean, we're going to get into some specifics around coping with anxiety in a bit because I think a lot of us right now in the world are dealing with that. But what are some specifics here? I mean, I don't want you to get into a whole like, hour long, what's your history? And,
Yeah.
but just like for our listeners to get a more solid grasp of what this might look like in practice. Say that I am someone who is from an area, like for example, I have a new client from Kentucky. He doesn't know any other vegans. He's living in a place where most of his friends grill giant chunks of carcasses on the weekends,
Mhm.
and he's got a lot of people who don't understand where he's coming from. And he's actually coming from a lot of different places, environmental reasons,
Mm.
health reasons, and ethics all together, right? So let's say you're in this situation, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are here when we're recording this. We just passed Thanksgiving for people in the US. So there's been a lot of these kind of situations where you're the only vegan, you don't know any other people who are in that realm with you. And you also have this additional layer of family members and friends who don't get it.
Mhm.
So let's say I'm in this situation. What are some things that you might help your clients with, or some skills or some mindsets that these people could possibly work on?
Yeah. I, I I think the biggest thing with this, and not to sound like too simplistic, but the biggest piece I think is you do have to find people who get it, who
Right.
get that
Okay.
part of you. And so
Uh-huh.
that doesn't mean that you just have to like go and cut out all your existing friends because now you're just like, "Oh my god, you're this horrible murderer." I
Mm-hmm.
mean, maybe there will be certain types of situations that you're like, "Well, I'm not going to come over if I know they're going to be like grilling or hunting or whatever," right?
Yeah. Right.
Um, but so it's not about replacing people, but it is about adding to your social support system people who get it. And that's where like as many aspects of social media as are problematic, which we know,
Yeah.
it's I that's one of the things that I go back to about like why I still do it is I mean I've met so many amazing vegans on social media,
Me
and
too.
some that have become very dear personal friends, some that are just like, "Oh yeah, this is like my acquaintance and like I love getting to connect with her online about this thing." And so it's
Mm-hmm.
not like you have to like yeah, replace all your friends, but having some people who get it is huge. So of course there's tons of Facebook groups, there's tons of great vegans on Instagram and in other places, and I think that's huge whether it's, for people who are lucky enough to have, I mean, and I think like in for example somewhere like Kentucky, if you're in like Louisville, I'm sure there's like a Louisville vegan Facebook group, but if
Mm-hmm.
you're out in the middle of nowhere Kentucky, yeah, it might be that you're from a geographical standpoint, the closest group like that may be hours away from you, and that's not ideal, but you can still make those connections with people near and far. And one of the things that I want to create as a part of like the Val the Vegan Therapist thing is I do want to work toward creating more community. Cause yeah, Facebook groups are great, but especially when they get to be like, there's thousands of people, like there's a vegan mental
Mm-hmm.
health group and oh my, it's like, oh, it is a train wreck. Oh my gosh. Like not the people are a train wreck, but like the kinds of it's just it's obviously not the kind of thing where there's like it's not attempting to be like, oh well, we are going to be administered or managed by moderated by mental health professionals who are going to
Mm-hmm.
respond to all your, so it's just people who are in a very dark place and saying all kinds of stuff that, I mean, sometimes trigger warnings great, but like these people need, like they need mental health care and they're just
Mm-hmm.
going posting in a Facebook group and like that's hard. So like groups are fine for some things and I think they serve people, but I'd love to create smaller community like group coaching, or like I was thinking I was going to do like a vegan church thing where it's like Sunday mornings,
Mm-hmm.
non-religious, but like a maybe spiritual, but all about just connecting with people who get you, sharing readings, sharing like videos, whatever. And so that is something that's a part of my vision of doing with this is just more opportunities to create vegan community, especially for people who don't have the luxury of having that in their immediate social circles.
That's huge. One of the things we do with our clients is we just have a fun group chat. It's not on Facebook, it's within the software that we use for our fitness coaching. And sometimes that is a lifeline for folks. We have a client in Saudi Arabia, there's one in
Wow.
Dubai, and one in Japan, where apparently it's actually really difficult to be vegan. And
Huh.
so a lot of these folks don't know any other vegans in their lives. And just
Mm,
having this really basic, it's not even like Facebook where we have different threads and different posts. Like it's just one discussion. All of our posts go into the same place, but we're sharing recipes. We had a lot of our clients are in the States. My assistant coach Zoe and I were both in Canada, but it was just Thanksgiving in the States. So we had a lot of talk around that. A lot of our clients were experiencing their first major holiday,
mm,
even in the pandemic world where we're not having massive gatherings. It's still important. And they're experiencing their first holiday as a vegan in a family that isn't. And
right.
so what you're saying, I think, is really important. And it might sound simplistic, just like, oh, yeah, whatever, it's Facebook, no big
Mm,
deal. But it's huge, especially if you're somebody who doesn't have those connections at all in your life. Something as simple as this group that we have, which is even simpler than social media, it's like literally just one thread.
yeah.
It helps and it makes a huge difference for our clients. And so it's not a massive group where there's thousands of people,
Right.
but it's 55, 60-ish like that, and from all over the world, and it's been great to connect.
Cool.
And so that's huge. I think what you're saying is if you're in a situation where you might have some antagonistic family members or friends, or there's awkward situations where you wonder if you can continue to go to someone's house,
Hmm.
something like an opportunity to connect with others who just get it
Right.
is huge.
Yeah, and especially around like, what I was talking about with like the feeling how I used to feel like deprived and like I was having to like
Mhm.
white knuckle my way through even being like pescatarian just because like I didn't know how to frame it differently. So that's, one of the things
Hmm.
that I really want to just keep spreading that word about is like that no, it doesn't have to be hard. Like people just assume like, "Oh, that must be so hard." I'm like, "No, like once you kind of figure out your hacks and like obviously I have a lot of privilege. So like, yeah, I if I want to buy like a vegan turkey sandwich meat, I can do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Now I could also just like live on rice and beans and vegetables and bananas and stuff. But yes, so it's obviously easier for me than someone with less means or less access to good grocery stores. But
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be this hard, like, oh, this shifting from that mindset of I can't eat that and like, oh, I like can't eat anything here to like an empowered place of like, wow, like I'm recognizing the smells coming in through my nose, like, I find that really appealing, but I choose not to eat that because it is so not in alignment with my values. And that to me feels so much more empowering, especially because I know I got pie waiting for me at home that I does align with my
Mhm.
values.
Mhm. That's a good way of putting it. So this idea of reframing is a good one. I think what you're saying is a lot of people may assume about veganism or maybe even come into veganism with this mindset of avoidance. Like, oh man, I can't have that anymore. Ah, crap, that used to be my favorite food. Now I can't
Mhm.
eat it anymore. Versus acknowledging that, sure, we all might have cravings. I mean, when I first went vegetarian, which was a long time ago, uh, 21 years, I can't even remember.
Awesome.
Anyways, long time ago. And I went vegan in 2003. So it's been a while. But I remember craving beef jerky of
Yeah.
all things. Like that is like the most meaty, chewing on a stick of animal thing that you could possibly crave, right? But what you just said about like, okay, so I'm acknowledging these things are coming in through my sensory, I'm smelling these things. I'm noticing that this is around. I might even be craving this food, but I'm making the choice because it doesn't align with my values. I'm making the choice
Mhm.
to eat something else instead. And that I think is maybe switching people onto this abundance mindset of like, wow, there's actually a bunch of plant-based foods I've never eaten before. Look at all
Mhm.
these new things. Like I didn't know what tempeh was or nutritional yeast or like all the basic vegan staples, right?
Mhm.
Before I went vegan, I had no idea. I'd never heard of amaranth before. I'd be like, what the hell is this? But is that something that you work on with folks? Like, do you have clients who are vegan and who are still kind of stuck in the avoidance mindset?
Um, I don't know. That's a specific challenge that I've personally had to help people navigate through as in my work. I think like people I've met or known personally who've been interested in going vegan, like I'm always like, call me. Like if you run into a problem where you're like, oh my God, like I used to love queso and now I can't, I'm just like, I can send you like an excellent thing you can make in your blender in 5 minutes. Like,
Hmm.
so just helping people realize that there are so many resources for how to replace those foods that you love in a way that is, because that's the thing is, and I think it's actually helpful that I used to have these horrible misconceptions, of like, ugh, like vegan ice cream is gross and vegan cheese is disgusting. And like, yeah, the truth is, and I'll tell people this still, even with all the amazing options, there's still ones out there that do not taste good.
Hmm.
So just
I
know that if
agree.
you try some that don't taste good, that doesn't mean that vegan ice cream can't be good or that vegan cheese can't be good. It means Not that brand. Let me find
Mhm.
out what a better tasting option is. And we are so fortunate in this time that we live in to have so many good options and more being created all the time. So that is something I have a resources page on my website that has a lot of like brands I recommend
Mm.
and stuff like that. But yeah, it hasn't come up a lot in my professional work, but it is something I'm like very passionate about. If you're running into a roadblock, like I probably have something I can share with you of how I kind of figured out a way around that so I didn't feel like I was missing out.
Mhm. That's amazing. That's actually pretty important. I think the food specific resources are the sticking point for a lot of people. Like, how do I make dinner? What do I food prep? What am I going to eat for breakfast? And so having those in your back pocket. I really like that you have a resources page on your website actually.
Yeah,
So we're
thanks.
going to we're going to link to your website in our show notes. So just FYI, make sure you check out the resources page. um cool. Okay, so we recently did an episode that delved into eating disorders. And so I don't want to get into super detail, but it is part of what you do and it is part of your own story. So how does that piece come up in the work that you do right now?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I can say to just kind of piggyback on the conversation you had with Devin was like, yes, it's super important to be aware of your motivations
Mhm.
or anyone's motivations. I don't want to discourage people, obviously, from if they're wanting to like try vegetarian or vegan alternatives to things. But I do think like, cause and this is part of my spoken word thing that I mentioned, but I was the 16-year-old who was like, I don't eat meat. And I was like, I was restricting. I was
Uh-huh.
trying to not have to eat as much food. So, like, having that again as part of my history is like, if I have an eating disorder client who's like, I'm vegan and I'm like, okay, but let's talk about this though, you know?
Mhm.
And of course, there's ways of kind of discerning and teasing apart those motivations, and that's important. But as you guys talked about too, like I really want the treatment world to get up to modern times.
Mhm.
Because having worked in treatment and like be at a place like most places that don't support that, um, it's just like, well, of course you don't support it because you're not giving them a vegan ice cream option when it's dessert night. But it'd be so easy to do that. So I really am
Mhm.
very excited that there are treatment centers who are now kind of shifting that perspective and saying like, yes, we fully support vegan, ethical vegan clients. Like, love it.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah. And like I said, the other piece of it for me is just helping to break down those stereotypes that vegan food is like second best, that it's you would only
Mhm.
eat it if you like were disordered in some way because like it's so gross and like it's delicious. It's you can have rich food, you can have delicious, fried food. And so I'm not I'm very like health at every size, intuitive eating. So I'm not a health food vegan. Like I love vegetables and I want people to be healthful in their bodies. I want people to feel good. But I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of people in the vegan world who can be, whether it's like kind of fat shaming or um orthorexic-ish in their
Mhm.
clean eating and moralizing food. And I want to be a different voice helping people realize that it's not pie is not you're not bad for eating the pie.
Exactly. Oh man, so many things. I am ashamed now to admit that I used to use the term clean eating. And this is like
Mm.
2013-ish.
Yeah,
Like that was the cool thing for
it
trainers to
was.
say and it's so horrible to me now. Of course, I never use it in
Yeah,
any of my messaging. I don't use the term junk food. We
yeah.
don't have
Play
good and bad.
food.
Yeah, right. Treat foods, play
Mhm,
food. I like play food. That's good
mhm.
actually. There's no good foods, there's no bad foods, but it's one of those things that seems to evolve.
Yeah,
And I feel like the professionals who are working with folks who may have disordered eating patterns or full-blown eating disorders, they're not quite at the point yet where veganism is fully understood in that context. And I feel like it's the same in the fitness world, which is still crazy to
yes.
me. I mean, both these situations are crazy to me, but it's the same where you still come across professionals, qualified fitness coaches who don't understand how to be plant-based and also get, you know, super ripped if that's what you want, or
Mhm.
really strong, or be an endurance athlete, any of these options. So I think what you're saying goes along with some change that we need in the industry itself to be not only more accepting of veganism, but also to understand how it fits in with folks who might have challenges like eating disorders.
Mhm.
And so that's where you would come in, for example. I assume that that's something that you could help your clients with because you get it. You do know the background, you've been there yourself. And so you can ask questions like some of what Devin was talking about, like, okay, so what is your motivation? Let's talk about where this is coming from. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that there's no one size fits all approach, right? It depends on where someone is
Right.
currently and why, like what's the underlying motivation for
Mhm.
being vegan, for example. So I think there's a lot of parallels here, is that like the whole diet and nutrition and fitness industry kind of needs a makeover still
Oh, yeah.
when it comes to veganism, which is crazy because it's taken so freaking long.
Yeah. But I
you
love
know?
that, like, that was one of the things when I found you, I was just like so excited because you know how rare it is in the fitness world to
Mm,
be someone who is like weight inclusive or weight neutral or whatever terminology you want to use,
mhm,
and who can recognize how, like, even though you know you didn't know this before and you've continued learning and exposing yourself to different voices and all of that, and now it's like you wouldn't use a term like clean eating, like
mhm.
that is so encouraging to me. And like I just had on my podcast the other day a vegan dietitian who, she doesn't really work specifically with eating disorders, but she's very, you know, health at every size and
Mhm.
intuitive eating and all of that and anti-diet. So like in those two fields, particularly of nutrition and fitness, yeah, there's still, I would say, the vast majority of practitioners who are not coming from that perspective. So every time we find someone who is, I'm just like, yes, so exciting.
Yay, that's awesome. Yeah, and it's one of those things where what we were also talking about in our episode with Devin was there's a lot of high profile vegan professionals out there, which is great. Like it's definitely something that's becoming more common, is seeing someone who has veganism front and center and they're a therapist, or like there's graphic designers that I know who work with vegan clients, right? Or of course the fitness and the nutrition professionals. But within that realm, there's still a lot of potentially problematic things. Like a
Sure.
lot of the vegan fitness professionals, like other fitness professionals, are still coming at things from a very judgmental, I want to say, perspective, where it's like aesthetics over everything. It's either you're 100% whole foods, no oil, or you're doing it
Yeah.
wrong. So there's still work we need within veganism. It's not just about spreading
Totally.
veganism, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that vegan coaches, nutritionists, et cetera, are just as, if not sometimes more guilty
Mhm.
than the general population. Cause it's like, we have found the path. It is only eat plants and none of these
Mhm.
oils and none of the salt. And it's just like, okay, hold on. Like our liver does a pretty good job of filtering some things out. So I think we're going to be
Detoxing
fine.
is not a thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's pivot real quick. Um, we're almost out of time, but I want to touch on this because I think it's a really important topic for the times right now, which is anxiety management. A lot of us are in a situation where we're like, what is happening in the world? We might have these vegan specific challenges to deal with while also dealing with holidays, the pandemic, people possibly being sick around us. Like, this is a lot to deal with right now, political situation aside. So, what are some of your favorite go to techniques? I know this isn't going to be a one on one individualized
Sure.
approach, obviously, but for anxiety management, for coping with anxiety, because everyone is pretty freaking anxious right now, including
Yes.
me.
Yes, totally. And of course, like these are, like you said, kind of relevant for anyone, whether you're
Hmm.
vegan or not, whether it's a vegan related issue or not, that anxiety is a universal experience and we need ways of skillfully working with it. So one of my favorite approaches for therapy and just for life is comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of great books out there like One is called the happiness trap. And it's like basically the idea of in our culture, we sort of, we do tend to vilify like quote negative emotions, and so then the
Mm.
more that what we resist persists, and we get really frustrated with ourselves for like, oh, I can't believe I'm anxious again, like what's wrong with me, and we try to stop the thought and it just gets bigger. So that's kind of like the idea of like the acceptance is sort of like opening up to really, and pulling in another term from DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, to develop some distress tolerance. So there's a lot of different
Mhm.
skills, and like people can like Google distress tolerance skills and find some great things, but really it's about like how can I sort of train myself to become not necessarily comfortable, but willing to sit with uncomfortable emotional experiences, because we live in this culture that's like, oh, the second you're uncomfortable, go eat something, go buy something, go like
Right,
whatever, right?
yes.
Distract you, pick up your phone. And so it really is, it's a different way of looking at your, I would say, painful or uncomfortable emotional experiences or thoughts, to learn what it feels like to be with that. And I'm not saying like there's absolutely a time and a place for distraction and
Mhm.
distraction skills, because sometimes like I'm not saying go and sit with the 10 out of 10 anxious feeling and just like be with that. Like sometimes we really need to be like, oh, I'm going to go for like a 5-minute run and I'm just going to shake it off,
Mhm.
to go and watch a cat video or something. Like all of those are fine. And we need to build our distress tolerance. So there's lots of ways of doing that. I mean, and then that's mindfulness comes in there too, because ultimately it's just, okay, well, what does it even mean to be with this uncomfortable experience? Well, it means I can notice I'm having the thought that I the thought that I feel really stupid for having just said what I said. And I'm
Mhm.
noticing my cheeks are hot and my heart is racing and my stomach is queasy. And that's different than going, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. I'm such an idiot. I notice I'm having the thought that I am stupid for having said that. And even
Mhm.
that, it's what we call like cognitive diffusion. When we get fused with these unhelpful thoughts, then we can't necessarily just turn it on and off like a faucet, but we can do things to help us defuse from that and see, like you even talked about this with, whether it's ed or it's anxiety, like naming that and separating from it can help us to get a little bit of distance from it so we can go, oh, okay. Yep, feeling in chest, thought that I'm stupid. Okay, got it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Instead of just being so hooked into all of it. So that's kind of a little bit of a combination of cognitive and a little bit of like somatic body based mindfulness stuff. And then in general, going directly to the body when we're feeling anxious is super helpful, because we can't think our way out of our anxiety a lot of times.
Unfortunately, I've
Yeah.
tried, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. So yeah, like some of this reframe stuff, getting the distance, that can help. And those are some like kind of what we call top down regulation. We're kind of coming from that cognitive angle. But bottom up approaches, that's where things like, yoga, and particularly something like legs up the wall is
Mhm.
super regulating. It's activating the parasympathetic nervous system, or kind of the brake pedal of our nervous system. So doing things that activate that, even simple bilateral movement, like touch your opposite shoulder with your hand and just gently tap side to side. So that kind of bilateral stimulation. Another one that I love is just called stopping the world, and it's just finding your gaze somewhere in front of you, find a spot, and then expand your awareness into the periphery as far as you can in both directions. Sometimes I like to kind of hold my fingers up and sort of wiggle them to where I can expand them as far back where I can still see them there. And it's amazing how doing some of these
Mhm.
strategies that are things you can do in 30 seconds to a minute can really regulate your nervous system, to where at least you might have like, okay, now I can more skillfully work with this situation, but not until I kind of go to the body first,
Mhm.
take a few breaths or tap for a moment, or do EFT tapping, which people can look up online if they're interested in that. Yeah, I just love strategies that take that bottom up, working directly with the body kind of approach.
That is amazing. We could do a whole podcast
We could.
series just on this.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know what? My counselor once said, accepting your anxiety does not mean you agree with it. So
Yes.
the acceptance portion for any sort of so-called negative experience, negative emotion, negative
Hmm.
thought, does not mean you agree with it.
Yep.
So I think that the overarching mindfulness acceptance kind of level, plus some of the bottoms up approaches that you just mentioned, very physical, maybe some breathing, maybe some, like bilateral movement, like you're mentioning. Those things together, I think, make a huge difference. And again, it's kind of one of those things like it sounds to people who haven't tried it that it might not work. You're like, yeah, well, what is
Hmm.
it going to do? Just like tapping on my shoulder, big freaking deal. But combined with some of these mindset and overarching approaches, I think it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, and it really is shifting kind of the paradigm and shifting your lens on it. And another image that I love is like if we can remember back to childhood, like those Chinese finger traps
Oh,
when your
yeah.
finger and you're like the more that you like try to brute force it, the more stuck you get. And that's
Hmm.
often how it is with anxiety. So like you said, accepting it doesn't mean you like it, doesn't mean you're agreeing with the anxious thoughts. It means that you're like, okay. So anxiety is happening right now. All right. I can
Hmm.
picture my little fuzzy friend is here. But the more that I focus on him and go, oh my God, go away, go away, go away, the more anxious I get instead of just learning that, okay, he's going to be hanging out here for a little bit, I guess. And
Hmm.
there's maybe things that I can do to support myself. Maybe there's some just riding the wave. Maybe there's calling a friend, whatever, but not having that like super, like internally combative sort of approach to it.
Absolutely. When I last year had what I call the anxiety shitstorm,
Love it.
which was pretty major,
Ugh, yeah.
hence the counseling and the whole bunch of things that I've done to manage it. But I called my anxiety Barry, which I think I mentioned in my interview with Devin. And it was that was my goal. It's like, okay, so he's this persona. My friend and I came up with a whole, like how he looks. He's got a comb
Yes.
over. He's wearing a 70s like suit that doesn't fit very well. Like he's got a whole
Very.
thing, Barry, right? But it was basically like, I'm not going to kick him out immediately because that's not going to
Yeah.
work. I'm going to learn to exist alongside Barry for a while and maybe work on a couple things at the same time, but he's still hanging out over here. He's just like he's in the same room, he's not
Mhm.
necessarily on his way out, which I'm cool with for the time being, but
Yeah,
it really helped. And so I think a lot of these techniques could come in handy in a lot of situations, whether it's vegan
totally.
related, whether it's anxiety full on for other reasons. I think those are brilliant. And we could totally do a whole, not
Yeah.
just episode, but like a series on those. But why
Absolutely.
don't we leave it there for today? So, where can our listeners go? What's the hub of all things Val?
Yeah. Well, for this audience, probably valthevegantherapist.com and at
Right.
Val the Vegan Therapist on Instagram. And I have my podcast, Vibrant or Vegan and Vibrant, that you can find linked at my website. I do have other websites for my quote normal therapy practice and other stuff, because that's what you do when you're an Enneagram 7, you have like 4 websites, but
Hmm.
that would be probably the place to look if you're a vegan or veg curious person.
Amazing. And again, we'll link to this in our show notes. So we'll have all your social and your websites there as well. But it was
Awesome.
so fantastic speaking with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, you too. I had so much fun.